Welcome to EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. I'm your host, Russ Roberts of George Mason University and Stanford University's Hoover Institution. Our website is econtalk.org, where you can subscribe, find other episodes, comment on this podcast, and find links and other information related to today's conversation. Our email address is mail@econtalk.org. We'd love to hear from you. Today is November 7th, 2011, and my guest is Gary Taubes. He is the author of Good Calories, Bad Calories, a quite extraordinary book that is our subject today. Gary, welcome to EconTalk.
Thank you, Russ, for having me.
Your book is about diet and health, heart disease, obesity, but it's also a book about a topic that I've been thinking a lot about lately in economics, which is the challenge of being a truth seeker when you have an ideology or a pet theory. So we're going to talk about health, but underneath the discussion, and occasionally right out in the open, we're going to be talking about economics. First, because the body, like the economy, is a complex system where it's hard to assess and measure cause and effect. And second, because epidemiology, the study of what causes various diseases and what might cure them, is very much like macroeconomics. There's a lot of data, a lot of statistical techniques trying to isolate the impact of one variable on another. So, Gary, you'll talk about the health, and from time to time, I'll interject a little economics.
Okay.
Now, your book starts with the idea, which was very prominent and commonly believed by a large group of people, that eating fat, and fat in your diet, particularly animal fat, isn't good for you, and it leads to heart disease. How did that come to be accepted wisdom in the medical profession?
Okay, well, let me also say, I think it's still commonly believed by most people, and the latest dietary guidelines, once again, are trying to get us to limit our fat intake and limit our saturated fat intake. So this is a hypothesis that grew out of the observations of one very zealous University of Minnesota nutritionist in the 1950s, a fellow named Ancel Keys, who came up with this idea that dietary fat raised cholesterol, and it was raised cholesterol that caused heart disease. And at the time, there was effectively no meaningful experimental data to support. Actually, I'll rephrase that. There was no experimental data to support that observation. But Keys was a very...
It seemed plausible, though.
It seemed very plausible. It seemed compelling. And Keys was a persuasive fellow. And by the 1960s or so, the American Heart Association got behind it, in part because Keys and a fellow proponent of this hypothesis, a cardiologist from Chicago named Jeremiah Stamler, got onto the American Heart Association, got involved with an ad hoc committee, and were able to publish a report basically saying we should all cut our fat intake. This was 1961. Like I said, no data to support it, no experimental data at all. And once the American Heart Association got behind it, it got a kind of believability that the attitude was it's probably right and all we have to do is test it. Or we're going to believe it's true, but we don't have the data yet because we haven't done the tests yet. And researchers start doing tests, experimental trials, taking a population, for instance, a famous study at the VA hospital in Los Angeles where you randomize half of them to a cholesterol-lowering diet, which is not actually low in fat, by the way. It's low in saturated fat and high in polyunsaturated fats. And then you put the other half of your subjects eat a controlled diet, and you look for heart disease over the number of years, and you see what happens. And trial after trial was sort of unable to prove the hypothesis true. But the more we studied it, the more people simply believed it must be true. And meanwhile, the American Heart Association's pushing it. Other observations are being compiled to support it, even though in order to support it, you have to ignore the observations that don't support it. So you pay attention to the positive evidence, ignore the negative evidence. One Scottish researcher who I interviewed memorably called this Bing Crosby epidemiology, where you accentuate the positive, eliminate the negative.
Yep.
Kind of is, it's basic human nature, but this is what happened. And as the American Heart Association gets behind it, the journalists see the American Heart Association as honest brokers of information on this, so they have no reason to doubt the AHA. And the AHA was honest brokers. They just were bad scientists or they were not scientists. So then the press gets behind it, and as the press gets behind it, politicians begin to think maybe we should do something about it. And a congressional subcommittee gets involved, run by George McGovern, that had originally been founded in the late 60s to address hunger in America, and they did a lot of good things with school lunch programs and food stamps, and by the mid-1970s they were running out of things to do, so they decided, since they'd been dealing with what they called undernutrition, which is not enough food, they would get involved in overnutrition, which was the problem of too much food, and obesity and diabetes and heart disease. And literally one guy, they have one day of hearings, McGovern subcommittee, and they assign a former labor reporter from the Providence, Rhode Island Journal to write the first dietary goals for the United States. It's the first document ever from a government body of any kind suggesting that that a low-fat diet's a healthy diet. And once McGovern comes out with this document written by a former labor reporter who knew nothing about nutrition and health, now the USDA feels they have to get involved, and you get this kind of cascade or domino effect, to the point that by 1984, the NIH holds a consensus conference claiming that they have a consensus opinion that we should all eat low-fat diets, when they still don't have a single meaningful experiment showing that a low-fat diet or cholesterol-lowering diet will reduce the risk of heart disease, or at least make you live longer. Because a few of the studies suggested that you could reduce risk of heart disease, but you would increase cancer. And now one study, the biggest study ever done, which was in Minnesota, actually suggested that if you put people on cholesterol-lowering diets, you increase mortality. They had more deaths in the intervention group than the control arm, and in that case, they just didn't publish the study because they got what they perceived as the wrong result. So it's sort of 20 years of this must be true, or why else would we be studying it?
So I want to go back a little bit.
Yeah.
So, and again, I encourage the listeners to think about the analogies with economics. In economics, we don't usually have real experimental data with a control group. We have some experimental data in microeconomics. When we talk about macroeconomics, talking about the business cycle and what we might do about it, we don't have a control group. What we have are natural experiments, things that happen in the real world that we assume are exogenous, and we can compare an after with a before. And we also have empirical studies using statistical evidence to try to tease out the individual effects of variables by holding other things constant. Now, in the case of the relationship between, and then we have logic, I should add, which is very important, often downplayed, but very important. And of course, it can lead you astray if you're not careful on any issue. So in the case of this relationship between diet and particularly saturated fat and heart disease, there was a certain logic, which is we were pretty sure that heart disease is caused by arteries getting clogged up by plaque. So the logic seemed, and therefore, if you ate things that made your arteries, that changed your cholesterol level, it seemed logical that, of course, it would be the case then that you'd have a higher risk of having heart disease and then a heart attack. Then you could ask, well, the evidence for that could be of three kinds in the case of epidemiology. You could have historical incidents, and this would be the equivalent of trying to figure out what got us out of the Great Depression. And I want you to talk about that. The example that stands out in my mind from the book would be Japan. Japanese comparative epidemiology between Japanese, say, citizens in Japan versus when they come to America. So you've kind of held, I emphasize kind of held genetics constant. And then so what would be left would be dietary effects. There's that kind of evidence that encouraged people to think about this. They weren't just relying on the logic. Then you'd have real experiments where you have these control groups. So give us a little flavor of those two kinds of evidence, the before and after, or the different populations. And then you talk about these failed experiments. There were no clinical trials that found some impact of diet on heart disease. And if so, what did the proponents of the theory, what was their explanation? Because they weren't alone. They weren't unanimous. There were the voices in the literature and in the profession that said, whoa, this isn't 100% proven. Yes, those voices were often drowned out, but they were out there. So they had to respond to that. So first talk about the historical, or what we might call the comparative, sort of a natural experiment. and then the actual data.
Yeah, and that's what, actually the Japanese case you pointed out is a common one that shows up, because the Japanese have the highest longevity of any developed nation, and they have the very low heart disease rates, and they eat very low-fat diets. Therefore, you can hypothesize that high-fat diets cause heart disease rates. When the Japanese come over to the U.S., breast cancer is a classic example. Actually, Japanese women in Japan have very low rates of breast cancer. So when Japanese women come to the U.S., by the second generation, they have the highest, rates of breast cancer as high as any other ethnic group. And one possibility is that it's because they come over here and they eat more fat. But the problem with those observational studies is, or those comparisons, you don't know what you're not looking at. So you focus on fat because that's what your hypothesis is about, and this is an endemic problem in public health. You just don't pay attention to anything else. So, for instance, sugar consumption's very low in Japan, and sugar consumption's very high here. So maybe it's sugar that's the cause of heart disease, or the absence of sugar that's the reason the Japanese are so relatively healthy. And if you don't look at sugar, you don't know. And so a common observation, one of the observations that sort of kicked this hypothesis up a notch was that during the Korean War, you had these young American soldiers who were killed in combat, and they had autopsies, and you could already see formation of arteriosclerotic plaques, and kids are 18, 19, 20 years old. But they weren't there in the Korean soldiers. So what's the difference between the Koreans and the U.S.? Well, the U.S. eat high-fat diets, the Koreans eat low-fat diets, but there's a lot of differences between Americans and Koreans, and American soldiers and Korean soldiers. For instance, Americans eat a lot of sugar, Koreans eat little. So you don't know. All you can get out of this is a hypothesis. And you can very easily be misled. And I had a cover story in the New York Times Magazine in 2007 looking at using as my case study the single most well-known epidemiologic study in the country in public health, which is the Nurses' Health Study at Harvard. And every single time they've had a hypothesis of causation from their data that was tested in a clinical trial. Without exception, the trial failed to confirm the hypothesis. Doesn't mean the hypothesis wasn't true, but the trial found the opposite. When you get to these experiments, like I said, there were a few experiments that showed that heart disease risk came down with low-fat diets or cholesterol-lowering diets, but simultaneously cancer risk went up. There was a study at a couple of mental hospitals in Helsinki that was a really bizarre study, but nonetheless, that was like one of the few studies to ever show that mortality actually increased on the cholesterol-lowering diet. So you had less disease and less deaths on the group getting the cholesterol-lowering diet. So that was taken as evidence that the studies, that your hypothesis is correct, but simultaneously a very similar study in Minnesota, like I said, the largest one ever done, found the opposite. Actually, they found a significant increase in deaths in the group that had gone on the cholesterol-lowering diet.
So if you like the hypothesis, that one's not reliable, and if you do like it, the other one's not reliable.
Exactly, and literally the investigators who did that Minnesota study just simply, it was finished by 1973, and it was published, if I remember correctly, in 1988 or 89, which was the year after the principal investigator retired. And I tracked him down. I'm a journalist, so I tracked him down, and I asked him, I said, why did you wait 16 years to publish? And he said, because we didn't like the way it turned out.
A moment of honesty. I love that.
And so the assumption is if you don't get the answer you expect, you did the experiment wrong. And that's still the case today. The classic example is the Women's Health Initiative, which was a huge trial that had a lot of different experiments in it. One of them was hormone replacement therapy, but one of them was a diet trial, and the estimate is that alone cost $500 million to $1 billion. And 49,000 women are randomized into two groups, and 20,000 are put on a low-fat, cholesterol-lowering diet. You increase whole grains and fruits and vegetables, and you eat lean meat instead of fatty meat. And they're followed for, I think it was 7 years. And the other 29,000 women need to, just go about their lives as usual. And what's interesting is you would expect an intervention effect in a trial like this. So you would expect to see a benefit from the low-fat diet, even if one didn't exist, because you've got your intervention group is getting an intervention. They're being put on a diet, and they're getting counseling, and the control group isn't. So it's not an equal intervention between the two. And despite that, you see no effect from this study. There's no effect on weight. There's no effect on heart disease. There's no effect on diabetes. No effect on breast cancer. And so the largest experimental trial that I know of ever done, like I said, $500 million to $1 billion. And the principal investigators who did the study, the NIH that funded it, the World Health Organization, I think even the Centers for Disease Control, all put out press releases saying this trial should have no effect on our dietary recommendations to eat low-fat, low-saturated fat diets, even though it showed that these diets were not beneficial, because the assumption is we did the trial incorrectly. I mean, we've been telling people, women, to eat like this for 40 years. We must be right? Yeah, so if the study doesn't confirm that, we must have done the study wrong, and it's always easier to believe with this kind of cognitive dissonance that you did the study wrong than you've just been giving the wrong advice.
Yeah, it's good here to remind listeners. I think I've quoted it before, but Einstein, after the famous study that he had predicted that the gravitational field of the sun would bend starlight, and it was tested, beautiful experiment, it was found to be true. Somebody asked Einstein afterwards, what would you have done if the results hadn't confirmed your experiment? And he said, well, I wouldn't have believed them because I know I'm right. And if you're the smartest person in the world, I guess, actually it's even more dangerous when you're the smartest person in the world, but that's a common view that most scientists have. And of course, many times they're wrong. It's the nature of science to make mistakes. Hypotheses don't get borne out by the data. There's things you didn't observe or imagine that could have other effects. Talk about the Ancel Keys' 7 Nations study, because that's another example. I thought that was a beautiful example, very similar to a lot of studies that I see in economics.
This is Ancel Keys. This was the study that began to shift the paradigm. It's interesting how these work too, because remember, Keys comes up with this hypothesis. He believes it. I think as early as 1952, he was telling everyone that he believed that all Americans should eat very low-fat diets, even though he was admitting that there wasn't evidence to support the hypothesis yet. So he could say those things simultaneously. In effect, like Einstein did, I'm sure I'm right, we should all act on it, and I admit that we have no evidence. So then he does a couple of
it's just a matter of time, and
Just a matter of time. Well, that's the word yet shows up all the time in these studies, and you could see it in newspaper articles. We don't have the data yet. And one of the things I'm always arguing to people in these fields is you may never have the data. Never use the word yet. But the hypothesis, as soon as you start thinking in terms of yet,
it's a slippery slope.
You know that you become biased and you're not going to be able to do good science.
Yeah.
So
talk about the study, Yeah,
Keys gets, because he's the leading proponent of the study, of the idea, even though he's done one bad study after another, and he's actually been spanked by one report that came out of the AHA, where a lot of the American Heart Association back in 56, 57, where they had a team of cardiologists, biostatisticians look into this and say there's just no evidence to support it. But because he's the leading proponent, he's the one you give money to test the study. And this is how bias can interject itself into research from the very get-go. So instead of saying this is a very interesting idea, Ancel, why don't you come up with a study idea and we'll have a group of very smart people design it with you, and then we'll fund somebody else who's unbiased to do it. Instead, you say, here's $200,000, you do the study, and Ansel's not really that interested in refuting his hypothesis. There's not a Popperian bone in his body.
But he's a doctor, and he cares about people. And of course,
well, that's the other thing. Yeah, people are dying out there.
I said that with irony. But it is, I think, academics, doctors, certain classes of folks get the benefit of the doubt, and it's presumed that they are unbiased, that they only care about the truth. And of course, they care about money, one thing, but they also care about their reputation, the glory, the fame. They don't want to be embarrassed. There's all kinds of things that get in the way of truth seeking.
Well, that's what I've argued, actually. I think industry influence is far less of a factor in determining how these sciences play themselves out than the kind of issues you just talked about, the ego, funding, fame, building a career. Once you've bet your reputation on a hypothesis, you cease to do science, you cease to test it, and now what you do is you look for data to confirm it.
You're an advocate. You become an
advocate. And it's true. I now have an alternative hypothesis, and I'm an advocate for that hypothesis, and I hope the hell it's right, because it's going to be very hard for any data to come along and convince me otherwise.
Yeah, I recently I blogged at Cafe Hayek, my blog about Keynesianism, and it would be equally true about the alternative to Keynesianism, whatever flavor you want. And I said, what evidence would dissuade you, if you were a Keynesian, you believe that government spending creates prosperity in the face of a recession, which many, many very, very smart people have been advocating, what evidence would dissuade you from that belief? And of course, we know that predicting 8% unemployment after a stimulus package is passed and getting 10 is not going to dissuade anybody. No Keynesian, in the face of the alleged or apparent or whatever you want to call it failure of the 2009 stimulus package, nobody changed their mind. They just said, well, it was worse than we thought, or we didn't spend enough, et cetera. So, sorry, I've got you off track again. Talk about Keyes.
Well, it's interesting what you're saying, because you have, here we're dealing with preventive medicine. So that's the fundamental problem is, you're preventing diseases from occurring, in theory. So it's not like you have symptoms that you could address immediately and see if the symptoms resolve with your intervention, although what this does is it turns high cholesterol into a symptom, even though you don't actually know if high cholesterol is the cause of disease. But what we've done is create a whole world of doctors now who think high cholesterol is a disease.
Yeah.
And then they could treat it with statins, and they think they're treating symptoms when they have no idea whether they're actually preventing death or real disease and hard endpoints, which is what you want to do. But you can never tell from your actions whether what happens is in an observation. There's a famous study in Finland where Finland changed their diet and heart disease rates came down in this one part of Finland, and ergo, they got people eating lower fat diets, but they also were quitting smoking, and they were also doing other things. And if you look at that one part of Finland, you say, this proves our intervention works. And then other researchers came along and said, wait, you've got the same decreases in heart disease rates all over Finland in places where you didn't do the intervention.
Yeah, slightly awkward. But go back to the Seven Nations study. What did Keyes do there?
Keyes chooses 7 nations to study the diet and study and then follow them for decades and see what happens with heart disease rates. And he picks nations in advance where he rationalizes it, because this is where he has connections, so it's cheaper to do. He already knows people. He's created bonds with researchers. They could help him on it. But so for instance, he picks Crete and like Yugoslavia and Japan, a couple of places in Japan, and
all over the world. It's beautiful. It's a nice representative survey of different types of developed nations, less developed, Asian, Western.
All nations where he has a pretty good idea what the heart disease rate is and what the diet is.
Yeah, it's awkward. Yeah.
So maybe he's stacking the decks, and it would have been interesting had he picked France, for instance, a country with a high fat and a high saturated fat diet and low heart disease rates, or Switzerland, but you're not going to do that. So he picks countries where he knows in advance, kind of what the answer is, and then he gets the answer he expects for the most part. So saturated fat tracks with heart disease, ergo, and so does cholesterol, ergo, saturated fat raises cholesterol, causes heart disease. I'm going to bring in sugar again because I can't help myself, but sugar actually tracks just as well with saturated fat, because basically affluent nations eat a lot of saturated fat and a lot of sugar. And Keyes is a believer of the fat hypothesis, not the sugar hypothesis. That was a British nutritionist named John Yudkin. So Keyes just says, obviously sugar is irrelevant. Actually, the idea was that people who eat a lot of sugar are also people who smoke a lot of cigarettes. Cigarette smokers, because they drink coffee and they put sugar in their coffee. So you could rationalize away the sugar. And now this is the most expensive observational study ever done. So, the findings have to be true. And we're going to believe it by virtue of the fact that it's the best we could do. Actually, when I've lectured to epidemiologists about this problem, that there's no causal information contained in an observational association, their argument still to this day is, but this is the best we can do.
Yeah, it's the same in economics, yeah. And the similar thing in economics is, and it's better to do something than nothing. And so, although we're not sure 100% about this dietary thing, we can't just stand by and let people die of heart disease. We've got to do something, and the best that we can do, given what we know, is to reduce fat, saturated fat. What's the problem with that? Because that's one of the more interesting, again, the underlying economics very apparent there. Why is that? Seems like better safe than sorry.
Well, that's the thing. Better safe. The precautionary principle is evoked. We have to act. We don't have perfect information.
Right.
It's funny, a line that I would get a lot and that you'd find in the literature, we don't have time to dot the I's and cross the T's. We don't have time to get what they would call definitive scientific data.
People are dying every day.
People are dying every day. This is the way physicians act. You're in a hospital, somebody's in a car accident, they come in, they throw the body down in front of you. You don't have time to get definitive scientific data. You got to act.
Yeah.
This is what physicians think they have to do. The problem is, from the scientific perspective, and it's one of the most profound paradoxes I see in this field, is if you just take the perspective of a hard scientist, not having time to get definitive scientific data means you don't have time to know if you're right or not.
Yeah,
it's that simple.
Like saying we got to get a man to the moon before the Russians. So although we don't really know where the ship's going, the rocket's going, we'll do the best we can.
We'll do the best we can. We have to act. We got to beat them. But again, how do you rationalize these? How do you make the scientific viewpoint work with because we know that in science, if you don't have definitive scientific data, you don't have compelling evidence yet. It means there are holes that, alternative hypotheses, confounders that could explain what you've seen. It's a toss-up at best, whether you're right or not, depending on whether you consider the odds against you 50-50 or infinity to one.
But you have to grant the view. You have to give something to the view that with your point about don't use the word yet. I agree with that, but I think the counterpoint has some merit, which is you use the word definitive. We rarely, if ever, get definitive proof. So in science, by definition, it's not definitive. It either supports or contradicts or raises questions of a hypothesis.
Eventually, you lose the ability to come up with hypotheses that can explain the data other than the one you've got. And again, I grew up in physics and a hard science where you could reproduce experiments perfectly. So, you could have much more confidence about whether or not another hypothesis is going to come along that's better at explaining what you've seen. It's a fundamental problem. You do indeed have to act.
But I think the key point, and I think this is why economics is so muddled, macroeconomic policy, key point is that in the area of diet and nutrition, we do have some hope that we will understand things at the micro level that would inform us about the macro effects. We do make advances. We do get better. We do reject some theories. We do know what's not true. And I think in economics, it's much, much harder to be optimistic that we're going to get there. But in the case of epidemiology, nutrition, diet, and health, we've made some genuine advances in understanding the causal mechanisms rather than just looking at correlation. Is that true?
Yeah, I mean, there are things you can, you can learn from these epidemiologic studies. High blood pressure is associated with an increased risk of heart disease, but you can't learn from an observational study what causes high blood pressure. What dietary, the lifestyle factors actually increase high blood pressure. That you have no idea. So when it comes to, you believe that if you lower blood pressure, you can reduce risk of heart disease, and you could do experimental trials to show that you could do that with drugs, and ideally you would do experimental trials to show that you could do that with dietary interventions. But what you find there, like I said, is you can get closer to the truth in nutrition and health. But what you find is how closely, much we hold on to what we've already believed up until now.
Yeah.
So, as I've written, there's precious little evidence to support the idea that sodium restriction will reduce blood pressure, and salt restriction will reduce blood pressure and hypertension, and so heart attacks. And yet, with each year that goes by, the effort to restrict salt in the diet gets greater and greater, made by the Centers for Disease Control and various government organizations. And the data just get worse. Like, the evidence gets worse, but the efforts to do something about what the perceived problem gets more vigorous. It's a kind of crazy situation where each time a paper comes out that doesn't support the hypothesis, which is virtually every paper now, the establishment responds by pushing harder to get the hypothesis translated into action.
Well, there's a lot of, obviously there's a lot of psychological reasons for that. And, my favorite tragic example of this is maternal mortality before we understood hygiene and bacteria and puerperal fever. And the people who said that women were dying after childbirth, there were two groups. There was one group that said it was something in the air, we had to keep the windows closed. And there was another group that said, no, actually, doctors should wash their hands when they come from the morgue before they deliver a baby. And it tragically took a long time to establish which of those was correct. But we did advance on that. We figured that one out. But surely if you had been telling doctors for a long time you didn't need to wash your hands and it was really something in the air and it was okay to go to the morgue, the idea that you had been killing women for decades is unbearable. So you're going to have a very hard time conceding the statistical evidence that shows the contrary. And they did. And it's a very human response.
I try to imagine the press release that the American Heart Association will put out someday to flip their nutritional paradigm. So they say, we just want to apologize that for the past 50 years, we've been telling you to eat low-fat, high-carbohydrate diets, and we now realize, as we should have known 49 years ago, that these diets will actually increase the risk of heart disease, diabetes, obesity, perhaps even cancer, and we apologize for, killing your loved ones. And
really sorry.
Really sorry. And on top of that, now that we've got our heads around right, you can trust us that the advice we're giving you today is correct.
Well, let's move on to some of the alternative hypotheses, which I find myself remarkably sympathetic to, which scares me. To get there, I want you to talk about what I thought, again, very interesting parallels to economic modeling. Talk about two ways of approaching many of these diseases. One is each one has a unique cause. There's high blood pressure. The establishment says, oh, that's caused by salt. There's heart disease. That's high-fat diet. There a saturated fat diet. There's diabetes. That's whatever it is. Sedentary behavior. There's obesity. That's you eat too much and you don't exercise enough. So they all have their own unique, and I love the way you point this out, they're all complicated. So of course we'd expect the explanation to be complicated, but you point out there's an alternative view, which is that many of these things are connected. Maybe there's actually a simple hypothesis that explains it. And so talk about what the evidence for that, what that simple hypothesis might be, which is sugar and refined carbs in your diet, and what the evidence for that is.
Well, and that's what, the idea is obesity, diabetes, heart disease are all associated. So if you're overweight or obese, you're more likely to be diabetic. You're more likely to get heart disease. If you're diabetic, you're more likely to be obese. This is type 2 diabetes we're talking about, not type 1. So they cluster together in patients, and they cluster together in populations. And hypertension is another one that goes with them. So like you said, the current explanation is hypertension is caused by salt. Obesity is caused by eating too much. Gout, by the way, is another disease that is also associated with hypertension, obesity, and diabetes. So gout is caused by eating too much meat and drinking too much wine. Yep. And diabetes is caused by sedentary behavior because we have to explain why. We can't blame it on eating too much because we have to explain why lean people also get type 2 diabetes. But the idea that they cluster all together is connected by there's a condition now called metabolic syndrome. Okay, and metabolic syndrome is a disorder of various metabolic abnormalities that are all in effect caused by this condition or associated with this condition called insulin resistance. So your cells become resistant to the insulin that your pancreas secretes. And as your cells become resistant, your pancreas responds by secreting more insulin to do the job, and your insulin levels go up. And it turns out that, type 2 diabetes is a disorder of insulin resistance, of elevated insulin levels, and obese individuals turn out to be insulin resistant and have high levels of insulin, and this metabolic syndrome can be thought of as it's the primary risk factor for heart disease now. So if you have a heart attack, almost assuredly it's not going to be because you have high LDL cholesterol, which is the conventional wisdom, but because you have these metabolic abnormalities called metabolic syndrome. And they're all tied together by insulin resistance and high levels of insulin and sort of dysregulation of insulin signaling. So you could make the argument that whatever it is that causes insulin resistance causes all these diseases.
And more importantly, if you could stop doing whatever that is, you can improve all these things, as opposed to, say, losing weight by a frantic exercise program. But if you don't change your insulin resistance problem, you're not going to reduce your risk of heart attack.
And that's one of the idea is if you do lose a little weight, you will improve your insulin sensitivity, which will then have positive effects on all these associated diseases, but it's virtually, you can't show that anyone can actually lose weight by exercising more. So now we go to, there's a sort of historical context to this as well, which is that going back into the 19th century, the British had these colonial and missionary physicians all over the world, all over the British Empire, and a common observation they would make is that you didn't see any of these diseases that cluster together, obesity, diabetes, heart disease, cancer, that they didn't exist in populations that didn't eat Western diets. Okay, so this grew into the 1960s when a British naval surgeon and researcher named Peter Cleve wrote a book that he called it the saccharine disease, because the biggest difference, when populations moved from eating their traditional diets to Western diets, the first thing that happened is they started eating sugar and white flour, because you could ship sugar and white flour all around the world without it being spoiled, because effectively there's no nutrients in it, so even the rats aren't interested in it. And so whenever a population went from eating their traditional diet, whatever it was, an agrarian population, a meat-eating population like the Inuit, or the pastoralists in Africa like the Maasai that lived on the blood and the milk and the meat from the cattle they herded, in their traditional diets, none of these diseases. And then when they started eating sugar and flour, you'd see these diseases occur. And with a pretty consistent, like first obesity, then diabetes and heart disease, and then cancer, and now you've got the whole cluster.
Of course, you have to be careful. You have to be careful. It could be this, what you call the diseases of civilization.
Well, it was known as the disease of civilization, and that was considered kind of a demeaning term because you're implying that these people weren't civilized, and so then it became Western diseases, and it's very commonly believed.
This is now
consensus of opinion today that these diseases are consistent with Western diets and lifestyles. So that's why the Japanese, for instance, having less of a Western diet, have less of these diseases.
But there's a measurement problem, of course. You have to be careful. When they get developed or when they move to a Western civilization, they often live longer. So you have to make sure there isn't that problem. You have a measurement issue that maybe they didn't diagnose it correctly before.
However, you could, into the 1970s, 1980s, when researchers are doing carefully controlled studies between populations, like even with Alzheimer's, the famous study where the same researchers diagnosed Alzheimer's in African Americans. I think it was Cincinnati, somewhere in the Midwest, and then they went to Nigeria and did it there. So you had the same researchers with the same diagnostic equipment and the same diagnostic criteria doing the diagnoses, and you got significantly higher rates of Alzheimer's here than you got in a similar, in an African population in Nigeria. So pretty much a similar ethnic background, separated by 300 or 400 years. Higher
study.
Alzheimer's here at at any specific age than you had there. So what would it be about the lifestyle that could affect that? And like I said, you tie this with the sugar and flour idea.
So that's Cleve. So what's Cleve's punchline?
Well, Cleve's punchline is you add sugar and flour to a population, you get diabetes, heart disease, obesity. And while Cleve is doing that, in the mid-1960s, you have a revolution in the understanding of the accumulation of fat and fat tissue. It took a couple of technologies, one that was discovered in 1956 to measure fatty acid concentration in the bloodstream, and then something called the radioimmunoassay to measure hormone levels accurately in the blood, which was published in 5960 by Rosalind Yalow and Solomon Burson. Yalow ended up winning the Nobel Prize for it. Burson had died by then. And with these technologies, you could determine what regulates the accumulation of fat in fat cells, and it turns out to be the hormone insulin. And as you study insulin, and as a matter of fact, one of the first measurements that Yalow and Burson did was insulin levels in type 2 diabetics and obese subjects, and they realized that, lo and behold, they both had high levels of insulin. We expected that type 2 diabetics would have low levels just like type 1 diabetics do, but they don't. And it's the type 2 diabetics that tend to be obese. So now you've got this hypothesis that all you have to do is increase insulin levels, and you store calories in your fat tissue, in effect independent of how much you're eating or how much you're exercising. So just like if you had a child that was growth deficient because they're lacking growth hormone, you could give them growth hormone and they will grow. You'll accelerate their growth and cause a sort of compensatory increase in appetite because they have to bring in the calories they need to build all these new body structures. The idea was all you had to do was, in effect, increase insulin levels and you'd increase fat formation. And this taking in more energy than they expend would be a compensation rather than the cause. One of the arguments I make in my book is that in any growing system in nature, in effect, growth is the cause, and this, taking in more energy than you expend is the effect. So if you think of a growing child, child gets taller, it gets heavier, and it has to take in more calories than it expends. He or she expends, but he's not taking in more calories than he or she expends because, she's not growing because she's taking in more calories than she expends. She's growing because she's secreting growth hormone, and the growth hormone is stimulating the secretion of insulin-like growth factor, and that's driving growth. And the sort of what's called positive energy balance is the effect, not the cause. And if you have a tumor growing, when a tumor is growing, it's taking in more calories than it expends because it's getting bigger, but that's not why it grows. It's growing because it's got all these defects and tumor suppressor genes and oncogenes that are driving it to grow. And the positive energy balance is an effect. And the argument I make is this is always the case. And so by the mid-1960s, you should have had a hypothesis of obesity that is caused by, in effect, this dysregulation of insulin signaling that's resulting in elevated levels of insulin driving fat accumulation. And the problem is that by that time, we had decided that dietary fat caused heart disease. And see, now insulin is secreted primarily in response to the carbohydrate content of the diet. So the more carbs, the more refined carbs, and sugars in particular seem to cause this thing called insulin resistance. So you've actually got a hypothesis that really nicely fits with what Cleve documented in 80 or so years of research that documented in these isolated populations, that you change the nature of the carbohydrates they consume. They start secreting more insulin, they become insulin resistant, they get fatter, they get type 2 diabetes, they get heart disease. But it couldn't be reconciled with this idea that dietary fat caused heart disease, and it couldn't be reconciled with what most lean people sort of naturally believe to be true, that they're lean because they eat in moderation and exercise a lot.
Which can be true.
Can be. Well, no, actually, I don't think it's ever true. And that's the point. It's sort of, I would argue that, body types are genetically determined, and the thing that can change, the genetic determinant of obesity, would be how you respond to the carbohydrates in the diet, how well you could tolerate them, in effect. So a lean person is a person who can tolerate a carb-rich diet and has the energy to exercise, and a fat person is a person who can't, and who, because of the insulin signaling, they end up with too much fat in their fat tissue, and now they don't have the energy to exercise because all that energy is being sucked up by their fat tissue.
So I want to cut to the chase because we have a lot more to talk about. And this is, in a way, it's a punchline of the first part of this conversation, which is that you come out and you wrote a beautiful, interesting New York Times article on this, particularly on the role of sugar. So you come out and you say, look, for a long time we got seduced or waylaid or whatever it is. We got too focused on this fat is what is the source of our ills in our diet, fat in our diet. And in fact, it's not fat. It's sugar and it's refined carbs. And I have to confess, and my problem is not as bad as yours, but I have the problem too. When I hear that, there's something so elegant and beautiful about it. So although there's something rich and interesting that each disease has its own cause, this idea that there's one cause and all I have to do, if you're listening out there, there's an incredible power to this. All I have to do is cut back on sugar and refined carbs, and I'm going to reduce my risk of obesity. I'm going to reduce my risk of heart attack. I'm going to reduce my cancer. I'm going to reduce my diabetes risk. That's a very seductive idea, particularly since for the last 10 weeks, I personally have started cutting back dramatically on sugar, and I want to believe, and carbs, refined carbs particularly, I want to believe that was a good sacrifice. I was doing the right thing, and I have lost a lot of weight, by the way. So I'm starting to think, yeah, this small data set, one observation, me, I'm starting to think this might be true. And now I read your book and I think, wow, this is the truth. But of course, you as the author really have a problem because you have a huge stake in this argument now. What's your evidence that you're not just falling prey to the Ansel Keys and other folks who've made the same mistake?
Well, this is what's interesting. One of the problems with this hypothesis, quacks always argue what you just described. Just do this one thing. I'm going to sell you a book about, by the way.
Yeah, and I got tapes too. I got DVDs. There's a whole. You can get a T-shirt.
Yeah, and that's so. One of the problems with this has always been that physicists love unified theories. That's all they want is a unified theory of the universe,
of everything.
Gravity, quantum physics, beautiful. We're going to spend everybody in the same business. Let's go find a unified theory. That's why nature works. In medicine, it's quackery. Okay, we don't want a unified theory of disease. And actually, one of the response against this that I get all the time is obesity is a complicated, multifactorial disease. And if I argue that you should begin with Occam's razor, don't complicate hypotheses beyond necessity, they'll argue that no, we're far beyond that.
You're not a scientist.
That only matters in physics.
You're not a scientist. Come on, that's not.
Yeah, I'm a journalist.
You're making it so easy. That's the easy way out. You've got to look at it. It's deeper. It's more complicated.
Well, and it's it's interesting because of course if you think that the planets have to travel around the sun, and this is going to get really tricky now and I'll explain. But if you believe that the planets travel around the sun in perfect circles, and you can't explain the observations, right, retrograde motion and other things, so now you have to start adding epicycles, and you say, well, it's complicated. And it's complicated because your fundamental paradigm is wrong. Yeah. Now, here's where it gets tricky. Remember, I started my career, we didn't talk about this. My first book, I lived at CERN, the big physics laboratory in Geneva. This was back in 84, 85, and I watched some excruciatingly smart high-energy physicists discover non-existent elementary particles. And then I watched the experiment kind of schism into two groups, those who were concerned with covering their asses and proving they were right all along, and the other group that felt they actually had a obligation as scientists to get the truth out there, even if it made them look silly, and they would actually look better if they said, here's how we screwed up, and we apologize, and if they never said that. And that was the subject of my first book, and then I wrote a book on cold fusion, Remember this huge,
Yep.
great scientific fiasco of the 1989, 1990. And when I came out of cold fusion, I used to say, look, anyone, when I was talking to journalists, I would say any time, one of my rules of science writing now is that whenever somebody evokes Galileo as a personal role model, he's a quack. Okay?
Meaning? Give me an example.
Well, the joke is I just, in effect, evoke Galileo by using epicycles and, perfect circles. But the argument is literally the paradigm is wrong. And as long as your paradigm is wrong, if you believe obesity is just about eating too much and expending too little, this energy balance idea, it's all calories in, calories out, you can't get the right answer. And the counter-argument is pretty simple. The counter-argument is that, look, we're just looking at hormonal enzymatic regulations of growth, just like we would on any biological system. And if we just pay attention to the hormonal enzymatic regulation of the fat tissue, then your problem is carbohydrates, and that should be your null hypothesis that you would have to refute. In defense of what I've done, the reason I got into this, I was doing this piece that I had pitched to the New York Times back in 2001 on what caused the obesity epidemic. At the point in time, the obesity epidemic was new enough, our consciousness of it was about 3 or 4 years old, that it was interesting, and you could imagine what caused it. And I had come out of doing basically a year-long investigation of science about the evidence supporting the low-fat is good health notion. And there were two things that changed back in the late 1970s to the mid-1980s that were viable hypotheses of why obesity levels started shooting upward just at that period. And one was that high fructose corn syrup came in. And actually, our total caloric sweetener, high fructose corn syrup is just another kind of sugar, and our total sugar consumption started to increase. And in the past, whenever sugar consumption had gone up significantly, so had obesity and diabetes rates. That had been from about the 1870s to the 1920s was the last time we'd seen a significant increase in sugar consumption. So that was one hypothesis. And the other was that we institutionalized this idea of a low-fat diet being a healthy diet. When you reduce the fat, you replace the fat in the diet with carbohydrates. So like the food guide pyramid, the base of the food guide pyramid, the staples of our diet are, pasta, potato, bread, rice, starches, all these
cereals.
Foods that my mother's generation believed were inherently fattening. But because of the low-fat dogma, they had been transformed into heart-healthy diet foods that we were supposed to eat all the time. So simultaneously, while we start increasing our sugar consumption, because we don't realize high fructose corn syrup is sugar, something that corn refiners worked hard to make us think, and they succeeded, we also started eating less fat and more of these, formerly believed to be fattening carbohydrates. So now I'm doing this story and I'm looking into this, and I come upon 5 clinical trials that were done and had not been published yet, even though the results had been reported in conferences, so I could discuss them. And they were all clinical trials of the Atkins diet. So now we have a hypothesis.
Atkins diet being a low-carb diet.
The Atkins diet is a low-carb, high-fat, high-saturated fat diet, in which you can eat as much as you want, by the way. Just don't eat carbs. So it's called an ad libitum diet. You can eat as much food as you want. Just don't eat carbohydrates.
It's lunch. I'm going to have a chicken.
I'm going to have a whole chicken. Dinner, I'm going to have, lobster Newburg or a 2-pound steak. And breakfast is going to be 5 eggs with bacon and sausage. And we had 2 hypotheses going in here. One is that obesity is caused by eating too much, right? So if you want to lose weight, you got to eat less, exercise more. And the other is that heart disease is caused by eating a high-fat, high-saturated fat diet. So now we do a clinical trial where we put half our subjects on a American Heart Association Step 1 diet. It's a low-fat, low-calorie, low-saturated fat diet. So, basically it's a small portion of skinless chicken breasts with some brown rice and lettuce for lunch, and breakfast, is a bowl of Special K with skim milk and a banana. The routine, we all lived like this for decades. And then the other is this high-fat, high-saturated fat diet, this Atkins diet where you can eat as much as you want of all these foods that are supposed to kill us. And in every one of these 5 studies, not only did the Atkins diet group lose more weight. Remember, they're allowed to eat as much as they want. But they lost more weight than people who were calorie restricted, who were told only to eat 1,400 or 1,500 calories. Their heart disease risk factors improved as well. So the diet that's supposed to kill you and make you fat, if you believe these twin hypotheses that we had all come to believe, in fact was a diet that made you lose weight, more weight, and seemed to, increase your risk of living long enough to see your great-great-grandchildren graduate from college.
So the counterpoint to that, though, as someone who has tried a zero-carb diet, it's not what I'm experimenting with now, but having done a zero-carb, is it's not sustainable. Your body gets real upset that it doesn't have any carbs, and then you eat one potato chip, and then next thing you know, you finished off 3 bags, and it's over. You're back to where you were. In fact, you usually end up weighing more after you're done with that. So those low-carb, zero-carb diets, you have to be on them forever, and we can't do it. So maybe it's not such a good idea.
Not only can we do it, but we've only run our tests out for 2 years, so we're convinced, remember, that dietary fat, saturated fat, is going to give you heart disease and maybe going to give you cancer, and we've only done the trials for 2 years, so the best we can say is these are short-term weight loss diets, at which point you're supposed to add the carbs back in. But the counter-argument for me is, it's very hard to quit smoking. I'm a writer and a freelance writer. I'm a neurotic. I used to smoke. I tried to quit every day for about 20 years before I finally succeeded. I mean, I had periods where I quit successfully for 3 months, 6 months, but nobody who quits smoking for 3 months or quits, and then falls off the wagon and goes back to smoking, it doesn't affect the argument that cigarettes cause lung cancer.
Good point. Fair enough.
But in this world, it does, because we're going to use every argument we can to shoot these down. So a common argument you hear is, it's hard to stay on the diet, therefore carbohydrates don't make you fat. And that's like saying it's hard to quit cigarettes, therefore cigarettes don't cause lung cancer.
Yeah, it's back to the we have to do something, and therefore, since this doesn't help us do something, we may as well ignore it. Yeah, it's
yeah, and you find all these rationalizations, and I think diet it's really like a religious. I mean, maybe economics is like this
it is
too. But
no, I talk about it all the time. We have it. It's dogmatic. It's religious in a certain dimension.
But in diet, we also have these issues. Meat eating's an issue. Abusing animals is an issue. There are vegetarians and vegans who argue that these diets are wrong. I mean, now there are environmental issues involved with this.
Sure. Supposedly,
meat eating contributes as much to global warming as driving, 1969 Chevy Camaros without tailpipes. And again, the argument is, well, for all I know, meat eating does.
But that's not the debate.
But that's not the debate. The debate is literally what makes us fat, what causes heart disease, what causes diabetes. And if you're already obese and diabetic, like let's take an obese diabetic mother, and she's going to give birth to children who are predisposed to becoming both obese and diabetic. What do you want her to do for her kids? Because starving them and getting those kids to run around the track, an hour a day is just torturing the kids, and it's not actually reversing the problem, because the problem isn't because they eat too much and exercise too little. Those are just effects, I mean, imagine you could find cancer patients who are bedridden and don't exercise at all. You're not going to run them around the track because you think sedentary behavior must be the cause of their cancer. So you got to give them the right. You got to diagnose the disease correctly. You have to identify the cause correctly, and you have to act. And if the act is getting rid of the carbs that cause the problem, then unfortunately these people are going to have to eat more meat, more animal products, because animal product, like when you say you've experimented with the zero-carb diet, the only way to do it, you can't do that in a vegan-vegetarian. Well, you can't do it in a vegan world.
No.
It's virtually impossible, if not impossible, in a vegetarian world. I mean, you can drink olive oil, I guess, all day.
Well, soy.
And soy. But
right.
There's probably, it's tough. So you're pretty much stuck with animal products. And it becomes this ethical issue, this religious issue, this environmental issue, when it's fundamentally the argument, let's get the health right. Like if somebody knows that they're going to doom their kids to a life of obesity and diabetes because they're going to make them vegetarians or vegans, and that's fine as long as they understand that they're not doing their kids any favor and that this is a choice they made.
That's right. That's the question, though, is that true? So let's talk. We have a little time left. Let's talk about, one, where you think we stand with respect to this hypothesis. So you said, well, persuasive to you are 5 clinical trials of the Atkins diet that seemed overwhelmingly to show that it wasn't calories in and calories out and exercise out, or whatever you want to call it, the energy balance model. It was whether you ate carbohydrates or not. Now, it's true that we all are prone to confirmation bias. It's true that scientists have their pet hypotheses. It's true it's hard to admit you were wrong. But there's 5 clinical trials.
Well, actually, there was 5 in 2001, 2002. There's dozens now, probably, there might be 100 for all I know. Now they're done regularly.
So the question is, there's a nice post on your blog about the speech you gave in front of epidemiologists where they said, what do you think? You think we're all idiots? So are serious scientific people who have the, as you call them in your post, the wizards, people who've got the right credentials and who appear to be scientific at least, are they moving in your direction?
Some of them. I mean, I'd say I've probably 9 years ago I probably had 0.001% of the medical research community on my side, and now I might be up to 1%. Or 2%. That's a pretty dramatic increase.
So what did the other 98% say when you waive your evidence? And just like...
Well, the other 98% don't pay attention to my evidence. I mean, there's probably 10%... that'd be an interesting question. As a journalist, the problem I have is what I call the "it's crap, I haven't read it" problem. And this was after I wrote this book on high energy physics. It turned out to be an expose because I ended up watching these physicists discover non-existent particles, and the Nobel Prize winning head of the experiment trying to cover it up, that they had screwed up. And so it was a pretty brutal expose. And afterwards, one of my friends in the physics community asked the sort of one of the chief kind of crony of this Nobel laureate what he thought of my book, and this fellow said, "It's crap, I haven't read it."
It's the parallel explanation for when you put forward a hypothesis and people say it's obvious and it's wrong. It's a fancy way of saying it makes me uncomfortable.
Yeah, or I know. I mean, actually, from their point of view, I know enough about it.
Yeah, you're just a journalist.
But I don't have to read. I know enough about what this fellow Taubes thinks. If I know who Taubes is, and most of them do by now, and I'm kind of an annoyance, I know enough about what Taubes thinks. I saw that Times Magazine article he did 10 years ago, and I don't have to know anymore.
You're just a fancy version of a quack. You're still a quack, but you're a slightly
kind of, journalistic version of a quack.
You're a highbrow quack.
And I've had this argument with people. It's funny because I've said to people, a similar way to think about it is imagine you're an atheist or, a devout Catholic, and somebody suggests that if you read Richard Dawkins' book, The God Delusion, it's going to convince you that you're wrong.
Yeah.
And it's funny because I have recently, so I said, in the same problem, like I'm an atheist, let's say I read a book that some journalist has written a book that's very compelling evidence that God exists. And even if I was open-minded, I said, okay, I'm going to read it, because I'm open-minded, it's gotten good reviews, and people I respect think highly of it. And I will bet you I'm going to get maybe a couple chapters in, and I'm going to think he's not telling me the whole story.
Sure.
He's twisting this and spinning that, and this is a rhetorical game, and I'm not going to get through it, and I'm going to close it.
Yeah.
And the funny thing is I have a fan at Yale who happens to be a born-again Christian. I said this to her, and she said, oh, well, you should read this book written by a journalist that's compelling evidence that God exists.
Yeah.
And I said, I should. And I put it on my Amazon, shopping list, which basically means to consider buying when my 3-year-old goes off to college in 15 years.
Sure.
I can't do it. Even a very smart woman, she's married to a very smart researcher. They're both
Oh, because I
respect them both. I can't read that book.
You've made a big investment in your worldview. You've thought about it a lot, perhaps. I'll assume you have, and you like it. And there's another piece of this which we haven't talked about. I happen to be a religious Jew in reality, and I'm very aware of the role of doubt and belief, and it all makes me think about economics as well, because we have the same issues as we talked about earlier. And part of it is it's part of our identity too. It's not just, well, I weighed all the facts and I came to religion, or I weighed all the facts and I came to sugar and carbs. It becomes part of the people you hang out with, the uniform you wear out in the world, the club you're in, your self-identity, your self-perception. And it's extraordinarily costly to change those things, and it's painful. And most of the time we don't do it. Now, not all the time.
Well, and also, before we started this interview, we talked briefly about Francis Bacon. We're not wired to do that. Once those perceptions are created in our brain, for whatever reason, we're wired to, in effect, reject evidence against it. So I don't actually know what evidence could be presented at this point of the existence of God that I wouldn't preferentially interpret as me having gone crazy.
Right. I understand that.
And
that's why we're not. That's why we're not going to debate it. I would say to you, and we don't debate it generally. I don't say to you, let me make the case, and you make the case against, and we yell at each other. We both realize that's not a fruitful experience. But it's interesting to me that in economics or in epidemiology, we're doing the same thing, really, but we're masking it. And this is the Hayekian idea of his condemnation of scientism. We're masking it in the language of science. We're using data. And as a result, what we're really debating often in these cases is dogmatic or ideology or philosophy, but we pretend we're debating about which study is the right study. And my claim is not to say, I would never say, oh, therefore evidence doesn't matter. That's not the point. The point is, have the debate, but be aware in yourself and in your opponents possibly being correct and possibly being misled and wrong. Be aware that you've got these deep-seated biases, priors, et cetera. And I love your quote of Richard Feynman, which is, the first principle is you must not fool yourself, and you are the easiest person to fool. And I think a thoughtful person, whether you're dogmatic about carbs and sugar, whether God exists, all those things, you got to look into your soul or your mind or your heart, whatever you want to call it, and admit that you're not a truth seeker in some scientific, ideal, romanticized way. You've got this baggage. We all have it.
Right. Well, this is what's interesting, because one of the arguments I would make is just, I don't have to convince people I'm right. I have to convince people it's worth testing rigorously. And in one of my challenges, I think one of the reasons we got into this situation in nutrition is because it's been a pseudoscience since the Second World War. That in effect there was a culture of science that had grown up out of Europe prior to the Second World War that was very highly, honed and rigorous and skeptical, and it kind of vanished with the war. And in fields like physics, we embraced all these European physicists who got chased out of Europe, and because we had atom bombs to build and hydrogen bombs and a Cold War to fight, and actually many of the leading figures in high energy physics in the mid to late 20th century were European emigre or their students, because they had this culture of science. But in other fields, particularly medicine and public health and probably economics as well, we didn't want anything to do with these people. So the ideas of rigorously testing hypotheses, of not acting on faith, not allowing an idea or an assumption to sneak into your worldview as masquerading as a fact, because once it does, it's gonna pollute everything that comes afterwards. And so I have to convince people that first of all, this idea is worth testing, and then you've got to test it right, because if you don't test it rigorously, you're going to get the wrong answer again, or you're going to come up with these kind of vague, nonsensical bodies of evidence that you can interpret any way you want. You're like Rorschach tests.
It's worse. It's actually worse than that in economics.
Well, I believe it, because I can imagine how to test I hope someday to raise the money. We're in the process of creating a nonprofit to raise money to do the kind of studies I think is necessary.
But in economics, the more certain you are, the more confident you are, the more dismissive you are of your ideological enemies, the bigger your platform. So there's and now, say in you talk about the change in the culture. You still there?
Yeah.
In 1970, there were two economists who could make a living talking about, not make a living, make some money at all, talking about public policy differences in ideology. And they were Paul Samuelson and Milton Friedman. They each had a column in Newsweek that alternated, and they they were very polite people, but they disagreed with each other. And they were able to have a nice platform because there was room for two of them maybe. Now there's room for hundreds because of the blogosphere, because of the explosion in information. And the competition is to be loud and sure of yourself. That's how you get to the top. And, of course, you can still be right. And I don't want to suggest that being loud and sure of yourself is not proves you're wrong. It doesn't. But it does change the culture of our profession.
This is the very the first book I wrote about high energy physics, Nobel Dreams. The physicist I was writing about who ran this experiment, Carlo Rubbia, was this very kind of Machiavellian Italian physicist who he taught at Harvard and he worked in Geneva and he commuted between the two weekly. And he had been wrong on virtually everything he'd done. But he just had demonstrated how he could move up to the very top of his field by claiming a discovery and then kind of moving on to the next experiment and leaving better scientists to clean up the mess after him. And this has been a common theme in everything I've written about, that people, by making declarative pronouncements based on preliminary data and then fighting viciously to get people to believe it, you can do very well for yourself in these careers. Nobody moves forward by spending their career checking other people's work to see if it was right or not.
Yeah.
And actually, one of my favorite lines from physics was from this Nobel Prize winner Sam Ting at MIT, who said to me, to be, if I can get this right, to be first and right is good. To be first and wrong is not so good, and to be second and right is meaningless.
Oh, that's deep. Yeah, that's deep. Well, we're going over, but I want to ask you two more things, and then we'll call it. Where do you, again, I think there's an important difference between epidemiology and economics, which are this cell-based science that you can actually see what's going on, and eventually the causal, it's imaginable that the causal relationships will be irrefutable, or at least powerful and persuasive. Do you think that's going to happen? Or do you think it already has happened?
In nutrition?
Yeah.
I don't know.
That's a good answer.
Again, as long as the paradigms are wrong, what they do at a cellular level doesn't really matter. And you've still got these huge, I'm thinking there just a week ago, there was an editorial in the New England Journal of Medicine by this Walter Willett of Harvard, who's kind of the biggest name in nutritional epidemiology, and this fellow David Ludwig, whose claim to fame more than anything is having written a column in JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association, so now he's perceived as kind of an authoritative voice. And they're arguing that the dietary guidelines have got it all wrong. And they're saying now then, so that we have to do much better science, and what they consider good science is these long-term observational prospective studies that are incapable of determining cause and effect. Mm. And the same studies, like I said, that if you generate a hypothesis out of them and then test the hypothesis in a real experiment, you get a different answer. So right now, the field, the people who are professing to be the sort of voices of reason, I would consider pseudoscientists. So we're moving in the wrong direction. But it's not so much even with nutrition doing cellular experiment, being able to see what's happening on a cellular level. You can do, if you think about it hard enough and you're willing to spend the money, pretty rigorous controlled trials with humans. That's what I want to raise money to do. If you can treat humans like laboratory rats, it's not easy, it's expensive, but you could do them where you, in effect, feed them specific foods, make them eat it, and see what happens over a long enough time period that you could at least get significant changes in well-established risk factors for disease.
You also have to monitor them because you got to make sure they don't sneak out and get that ice cream fix.
Well, that's one of the things that makes it expensive. You have to do it in a kind of enclosed environment so you could demonstrate that they're eating what you told them, what you gave them.
Yeah.
This is not the culture of the field at the moment. And it hasn't been, like I said, for 50 years. I think that can change, but there I'm probably being naive. But we'll see. Okay, so I hope so.
The last thing I want to ask you is that, somewhat like economics, but not really. There's the administrative, institutional, government-driven, funding-driven, reputational-driven beliefs that come out of the scientific community. And we've talked today about how they've swung back and forth over time, and sometimes in ways that we might think are okay, sometimes not so encouraging. But there's also what everybody believes down on the ground, those people like me. So if I like your theory, I might ignore all the institutional so-called wisdom of the so-called experts, and I'm just going to keep going with my low sugar, low refined carb diet, and I'm going to get my own little test, and it's one observation, and it's flawed, but I'm going to make my own decision, and I've got the placebo effect working for me too in the background, by the way. So even if it doesn't work, the fact that I believe it might help me anyway.
I've got nothing against a good placebo
Yeah,
effect.
It's awesome. And you're selling a lot of books, I'm sure. People like this, and as you point out in the beginning of your book, which I found utterly fascinating, the relationship between carbohydrate consumption and weight loss was folk wisdom for a long time. And people believed it and acted on it and lost a lot of weight, and maybe you'll win anyway. So what's your reaction to that?
That's one possibility. I think this idea that refined carbs and sugars are bad has actually already been accepted sort of popularly.
Yeah, it's how
bad.
If
you look at when people do diet trials now, low-fat diets are still... they'll now give advice, don't eat white bread, don't eat starches, you're supposed to eat whole grains and what are called low glycemic index carbohydrates, which are carbohydrate foods that you digest slowly, so it's all aimed at in effect, suppressing insulin levels. I think that'll be accepted. And I've actually had people say, you're not saying anything we don't already know. It's good
it's
carbs
obvious,
and bad carbs and good fats and bad fats. The battle is getting it accepted that fats are not only good, including saturated fats, but they might be necessities, and they might be the more you eat, the better. And that's going to take more time. But it is true that everyone can do an N of 1 experiment here. When it's coming to weight, that's how I did this. I did an experiment 10 years ago. It was actually an economist named Andrew Lowe. Do you know Andrew?
At
MIT?
No.
He runs a laboratory for financial engineering, and I was interviewing, when I was doing this story on dietary fat for science, I was also doing a story for Discover on the mathematics of the stock market, and I was interviewing Andrew, and he said, if you're doing fat, you got to try the Atkins diet. It's a high-fat, high-saturated fat diet. He said he had a colleague at Wharton whose father lost 200 pounds on it. He said he lost 40 pounds basically giving up white rice, and I should do it. And I tried it, and you lose weight effortlessly, and you're not hungry, and so anyone can do it. The question is you don't know if you're going to kill yourself.
Right. You don't know what the longer run...
and that's where you need the clinical trials just to, have this faith that while you're sitting there eating your eggs and bacon in the morning, you are not indeed clogging your arteries.
Or doing something else that you don't, you're losing weight, but there's an unintended consequence, which is what happens.
And you just never know. And when you do, I'm a 55-year-old man. I have ailments, and I never know, are they caused by my diet? I don't know. Or would I be in worse shape if I was on the diet I used to eat?
Just like stimulus. Either it wasn't big enough, it either made the economy worse, or it just wasn't big enough. Hard to distinguish between the two. Unfortunately, that's for our country. For you as an individual, I care about you too, but we ought to be making those decisions on somewhat scientific basis, it seems to me.
Well, that's in one of the arguments I've made too when I lecture in medical schools and research. Look, we've got this obesity and diabetes epidemic going on. I mean, diabetes rates, diagnoses have tripled since 1980 in 30 years. I mean, that's an enormous increase, and no matter how much is a diagnostic effect or changing diagnostic criteria. Something has changed, and it's changed during this period that you've insisted you know what causes obesity and what causes diabetes and what kind of diet we should eat. Can't you accept that maybe you got it wrong? And then they say, oh, yeah, maybe we got it wrong, but it's multifactorial and complex.
Do you find it challenging to this idea, by the way, that despite, or any reaction to the fact that despite these rises, these increases in diabetes, heart disease, et cetera, obesity, lifespan keeps getting longer every year?
It's an interesting finding. The thing with lifespan is it's so, if you think about the number of bypass surgeries you do every year, the number of, the extraordinary increases in, what you have to establish in effect is that you're actually, how much of that is lifestyle and how much of that is...
You need a counterfactual.
Yeah.
You don't have one.
And you don't know. And that's the thing. So it's sort of... but it's interesting. Like I've often wondered if I'm going to blame obesity, diabetes, heart disease, cancer, et cetera, on sugar and refined carbs, what are you going to die from if you don't eat it? And then my theory is, okay, you're in perfect health. You could go to your grandkid's third birthday when you're 75. You have one you have one ice cream cone and your heart blows up because you're not inured to these things.
Yeah, who knows?
And then everyone blames it on your low-carb diet that you've been eating until then. But that's you still have to do a randomized control trial. The fact that we're living longer could be just the wonders of medical care and hospitals and the emergency room, the emergency medical services.
But economists tend to look at fundamental nutrition, and actually they go the other way. Economists tend to explain lifespan by the fact that nutrition's improved dramatically, just in terms of raw calories. And we're fat because food's cheap. So we're we use Occam's razor too. So except then again, the argument I make is, food's cheap, but why is it that poor people are fatter than rich people, and why is it that you could find populations that at levels of obesity equal to that we have in the U.S. today that were unimaginably poor? Fair enough. My guest today has been Gary Taubes. Gary, it's been great having you on EconTalk.
Thank you, Russ. This has been great.
This is EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. For more EconTalk, go to econtalk.org, where you can also comment on today's podcast and find links and readings related to today's conversation. The sound engineer for EconTalk is Rich Goyette. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on Monday.